class? Interesting question, right? Well, if you are like many Americans, you don't quite know how to answer that question. But you do know that your bank account seems lighter and that rising gas and food prices and even higher rents and mortgage rates have you in your feelings. Today, we're going all in on what it means to be middle class and what's behind the recent scary headlines decrying the hollowing out of America's middle class and particularly America's middle class neighborhoods. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
If you're like many Americans, you don't quite know how to characterize yourself. Well, if you're Rihanna, you know you are like a billionaire. But short of being Rihanna or Jeff Bezos or one of the billionaires that's constantly in the news, most Americans don't know if they are still considered a part of the middle class. How are you to tell? Does it matter if you are married? Does it take into consideration if you have children? How many children? Does that matter? What about the state you live in? You might make a certain amount of money and consider yourself middle class in the town, but if you move to one of these big coastal cities like Los Angeles or New York, you may not feel so middle class. And what about education? Does that matter? Do you have to finish college to be considered middle class? And then what about home ownership? That used to be a significant marker of individuals in the middle class status or moving into it. Does home ownership and other assets, do they still matter? So many questions about what middle class is, and then these headlines, New York Times and other newspapers talking about the shrinking, yes, the shrinking middle class and the large and growing disparity in this country between the haves and the have-nots. What does all of this mean for everyday people, working class people who are working every day to make ends meet in this country? Is that group of people, that huge part, what used to be the biggest part of this economy, are they really shrinking? And where are they going if they're disappearing? We have some experts here today to help us sort all of this out. My first guest is David Madeline. He is a senior fellow and advisor at American Worker Project at the Center for American Progress. He's also the author of a very important book called Hollowed Out: Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class. Good morning and welcome back, David. We've had you on the show before talking about labor issues, but today we're really talking about these scary headlines about the shrinking middle class. First, I want to ask you, help us get a better definition, because I'm not certain that there is a definition that we can all agree on. When I did some research on this, different institutes came up with different numbers, and it varied from people making $42,000 to $127,000. One of the reports said. Another institute said it's $30,000 to $70,000. So how are you, someone who's worked in this field for decades, how should we be defining America's middle class?
Well, Areva, thanks very much for having me back. And as you hit on, there's no accepted definition of the middle class. And people might define it slightly differently, whether based on the income, wealth, home ownership, education levels. But the basic story, I think all of these different ways of trying to define middle as something that's not poor and not rich, they all tend to point in the same direction, that there's been fewer people sort of near the center, and the people in the center aren't necessarily doing as well as they used to. Some of them have gotten richer, some of them have gotten poorer, but in essence, the middle class is being hollowed out. And we can talk sort of about the numbers and how a little bit more there, but the basic story is pretty similar based on different definitions.
So help us understand, I think people who were around in the 70s and 80s remember these neighborhoods, particularly in places like Detroit and Cleveland and middle cities or Midwestern cities, where the middle class was thought of, people who had jobs, maybe they were professional jobs, maybe, slightly less than white collar jobs, but they owned a home. They had a couple of cars in their driveways. They took vacations. They probably had a pension. They had health care. Many of them worked at big auto plants. If you were living in Michigan, or for example, in Detroit, is that kind of the image of the middle class that we use often in this country when we think about middle class families?
Sure, I think that's a pretty common way of thinking about it. Although for some that might seem rich, vacation and all of those things. But that idea where a typical household could have some comforts was kind of embodied the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, maybe up until the 80s economy. And there, the thing though is, the typical male worker earns today just about the same as they did in the early 1970s. And so it's not that they've necessarily gone worse, they just haven't done better but at the same time, the economy has gone much richer. The overall size of the economy is bigger. It's just that most of those gains have gone towards the rich. And so there's this pulling away. The rich are just pulling further and further away from the middle class. And there's fewer people in the sort of however you define the middle class. So it seems then now you're trying to compare yourself. You think you're in the middle and you're like, well, I don't have all those things those other people have. And it feels like I'm falling further behind.
So let's talk about some of those things that people used to have. You talk about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, things like pensions. So you could work on a job for 30, 40 years. And a lot of people stayed on the same job and they would retire. And they're some in 50s, but definitely by the 60s. And they would have a pension that they could rely on, income every month, until they died. Many had lifetime medical benefits. Are those kinds of jobs still around? Like not that many people stay on jobs today for 30 years, but let's say hypothetically, if you went to a job and stayed 15, 20 years, are you likely to receive some kind of lifetime pension?
Oh, no. The pension, sadly, is going away for most workers. Some people that are unionized are sort of, for example, more likely to hold on to their pension. But the pension, and this has been the larger story of the economy, has shifted more work onto individuals. So workers might today have a 401k, but they're supposed to be responsible for their own retirement. And for some, that's worked very well. They've gotten rich. They've invested well. They've had a high income that enabled them to invest, and they're going to retire well. But for most people, the 401k has been a very poor substitute for a pension. They, have to make all these complicated decisions. They're at the whims of the stock market. For example, we're going to try to retire right before the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, and all of a sudden 20 or 30% of their lifetime wealth evaporates. So yeah, and that's another element that, some definitions of middle class might not get to, but this basic sense of security is going away for a lot of people.
So, David, this economist I was reading, his name is Stephen Horowitz. He's at Ball State University. He talks about the fact that the middle class, the hollowing out of the middle class is not a bad thing for the country, and says many of those people that were in the middle have moved into this upper income bracket, and now they're earning more than, he sets this number at $80,000. And he says this income inequality isn't such a bad thing, because more people have moved into that upper income category than those that have moved into the bottom part of that economic, kind of a continuum. Do you agree with that? Well, first, starting with, have more people in the middle move to the upper income, or have more move to the bottom?
Well, again, it gets back to how you define the middle class. Certainly, that no matter how you look at it, some have gotten richer and have moved out of the middle class and are richer, and some have moved down below and are poorer. And so that story I won't really disagree with, but the real problem is how you think about the consequences of the hollowing out of the middle class. And I think it's quite a bad thing. And it's bad not just for those people who aren't getting richer, but it's bad for all of society. You can think of the impact on our democracy, for example. So the rich have a lot more influence on what politicians do, and now the rest of us have far less influence, so government doesn't work as well. We also have the economy is not working as well, because the basis for companies making investments and growing is this growing consumer demand. But if the base of the middle class is not able to sort of have their incomes growing and their demand growing, then it's dependent upon the economy becomes dependent upon the consumption of the rich, and that's a much more unstable situation. But even beyond that, kind of some subtle things that are happening that I think are very important is the hollowing out of the middle class has also undermined trust in our society. So when people share similar incomes, they tend to think others have similar experiences and lifestyles and are like them. But as we separate into rich and poor, people feel distance, and that means we don't think they're like us, so we're not going to trust them in a whole bunch of ways. You can see that in like the polarization of our politics, but even just in sort of lawyering, using lawyers instead of just coming together to talk. And this is sort of a corrosive impact. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the impact on mobility, this idea you can rise up. And unfortunately, as inequality rises, fewer people are able to make the way from poor middle class up into higher territory. And that means we're not developing the talents and the potential of a whole lot of people.
But Dr. Horowitz says more people are moving into this kind of wealthier class. So you disagree with that?
Yeah, and the people that are moving were kind of close to the higher end anyway. The studies show that inequality, when you have a society, whether it's a city, a country, or a county, sort of whatever you look at, the places that have a stronger middle class and less inequality, countries like whether it's Sweden or Denmark, or counties in the US that have lower inequalities, people are more likely to go from being poor or middle class to where they then become rich in a society that has a stronger middle class that's more equitable. It's just those gaps on the ladder become much harder to scale for people when you have society that's polarized.
But what are you considering, since we can't agree, David, on what the definition of middle class is? What's the definition of rich?
Well, so most of those studies that I'm talking about tend to define, they'll look at the share of income going to the top 1%, for example. And so that's been the major shift in our economy over the years. The hollowing out is in large part because the top 1% or even the 0.001% have taken most of the economy's gains over recent decades. So yes, some people have moved up from the 50th to the 75th percentile, and they're doing a little bit better. But really, the real action has been at the very, very top. And when that's happens, they have, as we mentioned, more control over political situations. So we have less investment in education, for example, or the neighborhoods. And as I'm sure some of your subsequent guests will talk about, this recent New York Times study, showing about how neighborhoods are more polarized. You don't live in fewer people live in a middle class neighborhood. And that, the studies show that the ability for people to rise up is really correlated with how the type of neighborhood that they live in. If it's really a concentrated poverty neighborhood where you don't have rich, poor, and middle class living together, you're less likely to get ahead.
Right, but there is that 1%. So we can talk about, like, during the pandemic, we know 500 people became billionaires during the pandemic. And, there's that Jeff Bezos, who we talk a lot about in this country. I read something that says the average, that he is so rich that the average American spending $1 is equivalent to Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder, spending $2 million. So when we spend $1, it's like him spending $2 million. And he obviously is the first person ever to get to his worth being $200 billion with a B. So, there's Jeff, right? And then there's like the rest of the world. So again, when you talk about the rich, there's the ultra rich. So let's put him in he's a category by himself. And then there's the ultra rich, like the article in Forbes now naming Rihanna the first self-made female billionaire. But when you say rich, I don't think those are the people you're talking about. Is it, David?
Well, we're talking about both, and I think that's actually you're hitting on an important point. So some people, a couple people earning a couple $100,000, that also is rich. But
let's stop there. So how are you rich if you're earning a couple $100,000? Are you considered rich in this country?
You probably have most of the comforts that you're not incredibly vulnerable to a shock in the stock market, or if you lose a job, you've got enough wealth to cushion the blow for a little while, or if you get sick, you have health insurance, you can take a vacation, you have probably a secure retirement. So you have much more security than I think a typical middle class worker would have. But and this is what I think is important. I think in a lot of ways, though, they're fairly similar to a lot of middle class when you contrast them with these billionaires we're talking about, because they still are somewhat vulnerable. They do have to get a job. Maybe they can weather a storm for 6 months instead of a couple of weeks. They still, most of their earnings really come from their work at a job as opposed to the stocks that they own or the companies they own. And so that's where I think the real divide in society is around the top 0.01% and most of the rest of society.
But so again, and I just thinking to black and white as a lawyer, are there any numbers that we could, maybe not all of us will agree on, but some economists agree on, that are separating these rich from the ultra rich and then separating the rich from the middle class?
Yeah, I'll try to give you some numbers, but nothing will be satisfying. I think that's what you got to say. So, the Pew, which does these number of studies on sort of how they define middle class, and what they try to do is say who is close to the median income, and the median income, household income, is a little less than $70,000 today. And so they'll try to break it. Okay, you're within 25% below that or 50% above it, and so they'll put the middle class at something around. I'm just going to look down about 50,000 to about 150,000, a little bit different than the numbers you were looking at. And that's a household. So a household is like 2.5 people. So that's not a perfect thing. Again, this is where the other ways of thinking about it are how much income do you need to be in the top 5%, top 1%, top 0.01%?
So we know Biden is saying he wants to tax those individuals that make over 400,000, right? Is that a part of his tax plan? So so if you take that number, 400,000, what are those people considered? So are they considered the rich under this plan?
Yeah, I mean, they're high. That's certainly very high income. You're probably in the top 5% of all income earners in the country, around that. So yeah, if you're doing better than 95% of the public, I think that's rich. Again, but then when you get to the 1%, you got to be earning about $1 million a year, and those people will have lots and lots of wealth as well. And so that's the other story here to, I think, keep in mind, is that the wealth inequality is about 10 times as great as income inequality. So we talk about, okay, someone earns 100,000 and someone earns 50,000. Well, the wealth disparities are just so much larger, and wealth really is, I think, perhaps more important for understanding people's lifestyles than their income, because wealth is your accumulated assets. You got your house, you got your retirement accounts, you got stock investments, and those people who have lots of those just have a lot more financial cushion than most everyone else.
And what about Biden? So Biden, we know, has been a big job creator. His administration, I don't think, gets enough credit for the number of jobs he's created. How are those jobs, how do they factor in? Are they going to help add to that middle class? Are they helping at all in, making...
I think that's the big question. And, I'm a big fan of President Biden's policies here, not only the job creation, but he is trying to, for example, ensure that when the government's spending money to create jobs like on this infrastructure investments, that those are good, solid middle class jobs. And so it's that we don't have the perfect data to know exactly if he's creating those good jobs like he's trying to, but I think the evidence will be that he will do that. And we can see that not only the policies he's putting in place, but also that this very tight labor market. So as we're creating more jobs and the unemployment rate is very low, workers have a little bit more power to negotiate, so that they can say, you know what, if I don't get a raise, I will leave for another job and I'll get a raise at that job. And so we can see that wages are going up a little bit. Now, inflation is cutting against that strongly as well. And so I think you're going to have mostly a positive story, but by no means an unambiguously positive story for Biden. On job creation, yes, but on the job quality, I think it's going in the right direction, but the inflation makes it quite hard.
So that New York Times article, yes, David, that article is disturbing because it does talk about how our neighborhoods across the country are becoming so polarized, and you don't have neighborhoods where you have a diversity, economic diversity in those neighborhoods. Why is that happening?
Yeah, well, much of that is happening because of these trends we've talked about, that just fewer people are actually earning this middle level, and some people are getting rich and some people are, getting poor. And so people then tend to be living in neighborhoods where the housing prices are of one type. And that means that if the housing is expensive, only the rich people can live there. They're congregating together. There's some other things that are sort of more directly about housing policy, whether it's our zoning laws, for example, or and really schools come down to a lot of this too, because so much of housing prices is dependent upon the supposed quality of the schools. And so people are willing to pay a lot of money for supposedly good school districts. And that puts an incredible amount of pressure and housing price appreciation on those good school districts.
And what happens as those neighborhoods become more polarized? So as you say, rich people want to move where other rich people are so they can afford these higher price homes, leaving many people who can't afford those homes in neighborhoods. And we know across the country, a lot of those neighborhoods, there's lots of de-investment, but we've also seen some of those neighborhoods experience gentrification. So what happens when when gentrification, or, people, white people in particular, or these upper income people start moving back into neighborhoods that had once been decimated?
Well, it's complicated. A lot of things happen. And so one of them, as you mentioned, is that when neighborhoods become more expensive, some people who've been there for a long time get pushed out, and they get pushed further away. They lose some of the access to jobs they might have had. They might have been closer into to those kind of amenities, or their friends and family, churches and the like. So that cultural shift happens as well. You also have these sort of subtle macro changes happening too that I mentioned, that because we're not living together, we think others are more different from us. We're more skeptical or scary. Or that becomes a good neighborhood, that becomes a bad neighborhood. And it's, to me, much of this is about that we are far less in the same boat today than we once were. We think I can protect myself and just do well for myself because I've got enough money, or I don't, and I've got to, fight to make it a difference, rather than most people are sort of like me and most people are going to do well. And I think that really changed the dynamics of neighborhoods.
And so your book, David, is Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class. So what's your premise?
Well, I highlighted a lot of the things, but just that society doesn't work as well when you have these great polarizations. So I mentioned that consumer demand is not, that's the basis for economic growth, but when it's dependent just upon the incomes of very rich and the consumption of them, it's not so good. But also these more subtle things like government not working very well. And so the problem, and this really contrasts with what we were taught for 30 or 40 years by our politicians, that trickle down economics, the idea that if the rich get richer and the companies do incredibly well, that everyone else will do very well. And that has not been true at all. And instead, it's really an argument about actually the strength of our economy. Everything builds out from a solid middle class, that our democracy will do better and our economy will do better. Our individuals will be much happier and healthier, more prosperous, and that we need to change the way we think about the economy, and trickle-down economics is not the way forward. And we are making some changes there. That is not the way most politicians in the past few years have talked about the economy. We haven't made the kind of pro-growth policies that I would emphasize that really are going to rebuild the middle class, but at least things like tax cuts for the rich are incredibly unpopular now.
Yeah, we know that there was a tax cut for the rich under the Trump administration, and that theory being, like you said, trickle-down economics, that if we cut the taxes on some of these big corporations, that they would pass on the savings to their employees. And what we saw instead was record increases in compensation for CEOs, record bonuses for top-level C-suite executives, and record returns to shareholders of these big corporations, and not much trickling down, Milton Friedman style, trickling down to workers. couple of solutions real quickly, David. How do we restore this middle class? We know trickle down economics doesn't work. We can't depend on rich people, taking one less trip to Europe and giving their employees more money. That doesn't work. So what do we do?
Well, and thanks. That was a really great summary of some of the problems with trickle down economics. So what I think we need to do are things that help make sure that we have a stronger middle class that like boost the incomes of workers, higher minimum wage, stronger unions. But we also need to limit the sort of game playing that the rich can do. So that means higher taxes. That means anti-monopoly policies, so that companies that have tremendous market power can't abuse the rest of us. And it also means fixing some of the rules around our democracy. So money in politics, so that the rich can't just buy elections.
Yeah, no, really great points. We're thinking about all these, the perks of some of these corporate executives, the golden handcuffs that they get when they leave companies. Even if they screw the company up, they still leave with, $20-30 million in severance pay and, the expensive yachts and trips. So, there is an income inequality problem in this country. And sadly, I think about those people that are in those. I'm from the St. Louis Midwest. I think about those families that were able to take vacations and could, take some time off if someone got ill or sick. And you're right. So many people today feel like it's just paycheck to paycheck, that if something happened to them, they're like, just a week or two away from what could be financial ruin. Thanks, David, for helping us understand what's happening in this economy. And hopefully some of those jobs that Biden and his administration is creating will help to restore our middle class community and neighborhoods, because you're right, when people live in their own little silos, that's not a good thing for our democracy in the least bit. So again, thanks for joining me this morning, David.
Thanks for having me.
Can't talk about this issue without talking about housing, because if you don't have income, or if your income is limited, particularly if you live in a city like Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco, my God, you can't even afford rent, less known trying to buy a house. My next guest is Dr. Mary Beth Shin. She's a professor at Vanderbilt University and author of In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It. Good morning, Professor Shin. We're talking about what's happening to middle-class neighborhoods, how they are vanishing. That was a big headline in the New York Times a couple of days ago. But also lots of headlines around homelessness. Help us understand the relationship between what's happening to the middle class in this country and this growing homelessness population.
Well, thanks so much for having me. So you talked about rents in places like Los Angeles, but in fact, there's no place in the country where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, and precious few places where that full-time year-round worker can even afford a 1-bedroom. So rents have increased and wages have not, and that puts a lot of pressure on people.
So I live in Los Angeles, and we have the largest homeless population in the country. California does. And LA County, any given night, 50, 60,000 people are sleeping on the streets. And we have a mayoral race coming up in November. And one of the biggest issues in that race is the growing homelessness population, the tents, the communities that are popping up in places, that they weren't, like very affluent and rich neighborhoods, Beverly Hills and other neighborhoods in LA County. Is this a new problem, or is this just now more in your face because of the communities that homeless people are building?
Well, it's been a growing problem, but it's not one that's always been with us. I mean, back in around 1970, there were more housing units that poor people could afford than there were poor people. And we had very little homelessness. It was mostly, some older white guys on Skid Row. One book at the time was called Old Men, Drunk and Sober. And a lot of social scientists thought that then, when those men passed, homelessness would end. But it didn't end. Housing costs rose, wages failed to keep up, and that surplus of housing units became a bigger and bigger deficit. And so that's what's led to homelessness today. Homelessness is really a housing problem. And when people can't afford housing, first they double up with their friends and their neighbors. They, share housing. They go into overcrowded kinds of places. And when that breaks down, they go to the streets.
And is California, I think of California, one, obviously the weather is a reason why we may see so many people on the street, unlike, cities that have cold weather. But is it the rising housing cost in California that is driving, the substantial number of people that are homeless in a place like California?
Yes. I mean, the analyses show that rents and vacancy rates for low rent apartments are what drives homelessness. So when rents are high and vacancy rates are low, people have no place to go. Some other studies show that income inequality is also related to homelessness. So this hollowing out of the middle class that you're talking about is also directly related to rates of homelessness.
And I think, again, you mentioned the white guy in the 70s that was the face of homelessness. And you look around LA County, homelessness looks very different than in the 70s. Paint the picture for us today. Like, who are amongst the homeless?
Mm-hmm. Well, we started to see new groups of people experiencing homelessness. Racial minorities, African Americans and Native Americans are at special risk. Families. At this point, the age at which you're most likely to stay in a homeless shelter in the United States is infancy. Babies are expensive. They outgrow their clothes every time you turn around. But more importantly, they take a worker out of the workforce to care for them, or they require people to pay for expensive childcare, which is hard to get and hard to pay for. And so we find young families that experience homelessness. Homelessness rates drop when kids get to public school age and childcare expenses drop. Now, people on the streets are mostly not families, thankfully. Most families manage to find their ways to homeless shelters. But we're seeing many more racial minorities. We're seeing people with disabilities. We're seeing folks that, for various reasons, are having trouble getting jobs because of job discrimination in employment, because of discrimination in our criminal justice system, because of discrimination in housing. We monitor discrimination in housing, but we don't do much about it. And all of those things, and the wealth disparities that David was talking about earlier are really important. For poor people, most wealth is housing. And so wealth disparities mean disparities in access to housing.
We know you just said that infancies, or when you have an infant, that's an indicator or maybe one of the predictors of homelessness, because raising children are expensive. Raising children is expensive. What about this recent decision by the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade in these states that are forcing women to carry to term babies, even if they've been raped, some states, even if they, have been victims of incest? Do you expect that this decision could also have an impact on homelessness in some of these states?
I think it could. Many of the women who get abortions today already have children. They may be married, and they just feel like they can't afford another one. They can't take care of the kids they have if they have another child. And so I think that will put increasing pressure on families. And the folks who are trying to ban abortions aren't turning around to try to create more supports for poor families.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about this right to housing. So again, going back to California, Sacramento's Mayor Darrell Steinberg was a big advocate of trying to get California to enact a law, a right to housing law, and to make housing a legal requirement like education. So states are obligated now to provide free public education to kids. That's why cities and counties have to build schools, because they have to provide enough classrooms for kids to attend schools. And Darrell Steinberg had the ideal that housing should be the same, that a state should be under a similar obligation to provide housing. And if there weren't enough housing units available, like you mentioned, that an individual would have the ability to sue the state for the lack of housing. New York had a right to shelter, laws in the 70s, and some proponents of some housing, or I guess housing rights advocates oppose right to housing laws because they say it creates this perpetual cycle where people are just stuck, getting shelters, and it doesn't lead to permanent housing. Where do you come down on right to housing laws?
Mhm. Well, a right to shelter is a little different from a right to housing. So, what the right is in New York is to a city-run shelter or one that the city contracts a nonprofit to provide. That's not housing, and housing is a place of your own. It could be an apartment. It doesn't have to be, a standalone house with a white picket fence, but a place of your own where you can lock the door, where you control over who comes in. A right to housing is not far-fetched. In the United Kingdom, there's a right to housing for so-called priority populations. So families have a right to housing in the United Kingdom, and it has brought down homelessness rates. And they're coming down for single individuals as well. The European Union and a bunch of countries in the European Union, not the Union itself, have gotten together and promulgated a right to housing. There's one in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's not always enforced because a right implies an obligation of somebody to provide that to you.
Why do you think we have more right to housing laws in the United States, given particularly our rising housing, unhoused populations?
Well, then it becomes the requirement of local governments to provide that housing. I don't think that would be a bad idea. I think we're a long way from that at this point.
You talk about homelessness in the context of a lack of housing units. The conversation is being shaped in California, particularly LA County, is always around mental health issues, substance abuse, and addiction. And they talk about not being able to solve the housing crisis in LA without addressing those issues. How big do those issues weigh in your analysis of why we see this rising homelessness?
Well, you're not going to solve mental health and substance problems without housing. That is, a substance problem is hard enough to kick if you've got all the resources available to you. Without housing, it's virtually impossible. So there are models that work for people with serious mental illness and substance abuse problems. They're called supported housing, and I like the Pathways to Housing model of supported housing. Takes folks directly from the street, gives them housing subsidies with private landlords with no prerequisites for sobriety or participation in treatment, but offers wraparound services. Only those services that people want, because services work better when people choose them than when they're foisted on folks. But mental health services, substance services, physical health services, vocational, recreational services, and people who get access to that kind of program stay off the streets, and they begin to deal with their mental health and substance problems. For families, it's even more clear. So we ran a big study, 2,200 families across 12 sites around the country. One of them was California, Alameda County. And we found that if you give families access to affordable housing with something called a housing choice voucher, that holds their housing costs to 30% of their incomes, you not only end homelessness, but you reduce psychological distress and substance abuse and domestic violence. So things that can sometimes lead to homelessness get resolved when people have access to affordable housing. Fewer separation of kids from parents, fewer kids having behavior problems, better school attendance, less food insecurity, all of this just with the provision of affordable housing without any specialized services. So housing is really the core for families. And for folks with serious mental illnesses, they need more. They need supportive services as well as housing, but they need housing.
But Professor, one question that always bothers me in this homelessness conversation, how you address it, is what you said at the beginning of the segment, which is that the wages right now for the typical American doesn't even support them paying for a 2-bedroom apartment. So how does someone who's been living on the streets for a year or two, perhaps hasn't been employed, who gets into permanent housing, how do they stay in housing? Because one of the LA County problems is this vicious cycle that people get into housing, they fall out of housing. They get 10,000 people off the streets, 20,000 fall into homelessness. So this is vicious cycle that keeps occurring. How do we make housing affordable for those people who maybe aren't going to ever find a job, or if they find a job, it's going to be one of these low wage paying jobs that would never allow them to afford, an apartment? Is it all going to be like HUD vouchers? Everybody's going to get a Section 8 voucher? How does that work?
Uh-huh. Well, an expansion of the Section 8 voucher program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, would be the closest thing we have to a silver bullet to end homelessness. But housing costs depend on incomes, and they depend on the cost of housing. Housing affordability depends on incomes and housing costs. So anything we can do to raise incomes for folks at the bottom rungs of the economic ladder, and anything we can do to reduce housing costs is going to reduce homelessness. There are lots of strategies for both of those. So raising incomes, we talked about raising the minimum wage, the earned income tax credit, which provides a small bonus to every dollar that a poor worker earns, making that more generous to folks who don't have children, raising SSI benefits. Those are disability benefits that are way too low to afford a modest apartment. And then reducing housing costs. And that's going to mean changing zoning laws, allowing multifamily housing to be built in more places, allowing housing to be built near transit lines, because some people talk about both rent and transportation costs as a combo. And we're going to need to build more housing that's affordable to people at the bottom of the income distribution. Right now, developers know how to build housing for folks at 80% of the area median income. They don't know how to build housing for people at 30% of median income. Because it's, you can't, even a nonprofit builder can't afford to build and maintain housing for people who are the poorest of our fellow neighbors.
Yeah, I want to bring Maureen Sedona into the conversation. She's the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in San Francisco, and she knows a lot about building housing and building affordable housing. Good morning and welcome, Maureen.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
So Habitat, for those that don't know, give us the quick, what Habitat does.
Yeah, Habitat for Humanity, hopefully you've heard of us, but across this country, there are 1,000 habitats in communities that are actually building one of the only opportunities for folks in the 50 to 80% area median income to become first-time homeowners. And homeownership is the thing that we know moves the needle for people economically in their lives, creates that stability, creates that legacy for children. And so Habitat is a great partner in your community to come together and participate in that. Obviously, we're part of the housing ecosystem that Beth spoke so eloquently about. It's sort of from all the way from the unhoused all the way to the housed, and in our case, to becoming first-time homeowners. And so we are at work every day as a construction company building homes in partnership with community and with government. And then we also end with our families, which is really our secret sauce of what we do.
And I'm proud to say I am a Habitat for Humanity ambassador here in Los Angeles. I've actually been on a build where I've actually had to, use my hands and do some plaster work and do some painting work in a home that we were building for a family. So really proud to be associated with the organization. Maureen, help us understand how the typical family has changed that Habitat is helping, because again, of course, we remember President Carter, Jimmy Carter, and his wife Rosalind, and how involved they have been with Habitat, and we've seen them actually out with hammers and nails themselves building. But I would imagine that as the middle class is shrinking in this country, that you're seeing families today, they look very different than those that were Habitat clients, say 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is Habitat used to be considered sign of the missing middle housing. And now, we're serving people who are in the low to moderate income, predominantly. And what we're seeing is, families who have been, as Beth described, living in overcrowded situations. So, we have several families. I have a favorite family this year who we just put into, who partnered with us in our new development in Daly City. For 14 years, the parents and the 3 children lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and were kept applying and kept waiting, and were on multiple lists and trying to get affordable home ownership. And this time they won the lottery and they're Habitat homeowners. And how blessed are they? But also so many people. For our last 10 homes 20 homes we had available, we had almost 1,000 applicants for those homes. And so people and this is happening at Habitats all across the country. The demand is so high, and the ability to fill that need is very challenging and very hard, especially in today's economy. And so, what we know is when people get stable housing and they can matriculate from rental to home ownership, or if they can have long-term rental, their children do better and the community does better. And the other thing that Habitat does is that we preserve home ownership. So we work with low-income seniors all across this country, most of them in the 30 to 50% area median income, but they can't afford a new roof, or they can't put that new stairway on their home or that new threshold on their home to make it safe, or to make sure that their home is safe for them to age in place. And so Habitats work every day with volunteers and their skilled staff to do this, to make sure that people can maintain that asset in their family and hold on to it for generations.
One question, Maureen, that's come up in this California, LA mayor's race is, again, who's going to be able to build more housing quickly, and the cost of a unit. I think an affordable house in LA to build is $800,000 plus dollars.
Right.
That blows your mind to think that is what it costs to build what is supposed to be affordable housing. You're in the San Francisco area. Is that number the same, or maybe even more?
It is that, and sometimes more. And what I can say is, though, it's a true partnership. So the partnership comes in between the public, both the state. I'm very proud to say that our legislature and our governor just signed for the first time a $350 million Cal Home Act, which will put $250 million next year, $100 million the following year into low-income homeownership production. So that's really exciting. But it takes the whole community. And so having we are building homes, and we are not, obviously a not for profit. And so we're building these homes, even though they're expensive, because the need is great, and it shifts the paradigm. And you have to look at sort of play the long game. You're really changing the efficacy and the outcome for these homeowners, and making sure that we cap their expenses at 30%. We offer a 0 down, 0% interest mortgage. And we work with these families and help them be ready to become first-time home buyers, get their credit in shape. And so that trajectory changes for them, and their children for, pays dividends for generations. And then when they're ready to go into a market rate home, we repurchase that home, and then we get another family in there, and that journey starts over for another family.
So, Dr. Shin, if it costs $800,000 in a city like Los Angeles to build affordable housing, how do we ever solve the homeless, crisis here in LA County and, of course, across the country? And how do we keep that 30%, keep housing costs capped at 30% when you have such high cost of build?
We need to bring the building costs down, and that includes costs of land, and it includes various regulations. I mean, I'm not for substandard housing, but people need and can benefit from a variety of different housing options. So it's wonderful that you're getting families into homes. Single individuals might do well with apartments. They might do well with housing that you have in San Francisco, with kind of small private spaces and some public amenities. And so I think we need to explore different housing options that will bring down the costs of creating housing at the same time that we raise income so that people can afford what we've got.
So we know, Dr. Shin, this paradigm shift of getting single family homeowners to even support changes in zoning laws that would allow for, kind of unconventional housing units in their neighborhoods has been really difficult, because those families that have been able to buy homes in single family neighborhoods want the sanctity, and they want to preserve the uniformity of those neighborhoods. And people have been very resistant to the building of multi-unit apartment complexes, say, for example, or even people being able to add on units, these small units that some zoning laws now allow you to build in your backyard or, on the side of your home. How do we get Americans, those that do have homes, to make this shift where there is more support for creating housing? Because at some point, there's just not enough vacant land. You got to get more creative about where you're going to build all these properties.
Mm-hmm. I wish I knew the answer to how we would get more support. I think one piece of it is showing people what housing does for folks, how important it is. And then you can contrast, would you rather have a multifamily dwelling down the block, or would you rather have a tent city? So we don't want to, we don't have to, we shouldn't, we don't want to pick our way around our fellow citizens on the street, pretending that they're not there, or wishing that they're not there. We can do something about it. We have the resources as a country to house everyone, and it really is a question of political will.
Yeah, and particularly a city like San Francisco, Maureen, San Francisco and LA are often used as examples of cities that are just overrun with tents, as Dr. Shin said, these tent cities. But I've talked to some advocates that say that people in those tents have a right to be there. And many of those people, when they're interviewed in the media, often say they're not interested in moving into homes, that they've built communities in those outdoor spaces. What do you say to that as someone who's trying to move people into permanent housing? Should we recognize that may be an alternative way for people to live?
I think it's dangerous to sort of, do man on the street interviews with someone who's like, yeah, this is fine, and we're building community. And that may be true for the moment. But I think what we've seen a decline and basically a cognitive dissonance or separation from seeing people who are unhoused as sort of other and othering them continually, and then seeing folks in community as sort of like, well, I've got mine, so forget you. And I think it's a very dangerous paradigm. And I think, luckily in San Francisco, we have a mayor who is fighting for housing, who understands the importance of affordable housing. And it's hard. It's very hard what we do every day. But there's many opportunities, and there's many more opportunities to continue to scale and build, not only for Habitat for Humanities across the United States, but for all housing organizations. But we do need that partnership. We need the partnership with the philanthropic community. We were talking about wealth earlier. Those investments that get put forth really do make a difference. So you saw someone like Mackenzie Scott give her highest gift ever to Habitat for Humanity, so that the communities, the 84 communities that have that, could continue on their trajectory to move the needle, particularly for BIPOC folks and others who have been kept out of the housing market, not because they don't want housing, but because we've had restrictive policies that have zoned areas and made it incredibly difficult for this to happen. So zoning laws need to change. The government needs to lean in, voters need to lean in, companies need to lean in, and families are ready to work hard and make housing, permanent housing, and the kind of housing that they actually need match their situations. So when we look on the streets and we see unhoused folks and we sort of say, well, actually, they want to be there, I think we're fooling ourselves. That is just not a stable way to live. And there's so many other unintended and intended consequences that come from that we end up having to clean up later. And so it's that river, right? If we're going to just figure out why are thousands of people coming down the river, and we don't ever go up to the front and say, it's housing first, folks. We have to get folks housed. We have to matriculate them through the system. We have to passionately and vigorously build and continue to build and build. We can't build our way out of the problem in 5 years, but it's going to take the next 25 years to do it. But we can do it. We can house everyone in America, and safely and cleanly and fairly, and make sure that these things work. And so I think it really is this sort of like, we have to have the right conversations, and we have to be willing to put that public will to those public resources. If we want to move the needle, particularly for folks of color, we have to make more home ownership opportunities happen. And I can't wait to be part of this. I do it every day, but it's like, I see it. I see the solutions there, and we just really have to embrace them and execute on them.
Well, glad to hear, Maureen, that Mackenzie Scott, what was that donation she gave to Habitat?
So she gave a total of $430 million, I believe, across 84 affiliates, and then some to Habitat International, which is working on a Black home ownership and an advocacy campaign to get more money and more resources to leverage, because every dollar people give to Habitat gets leveraged 7 times. Wow. To help build housing. So, and we're not the only ones. Like everyone who's doing this work, we are brothers and sisters in this fight to try to help our communities and get our folks housed first, so all the other things can happen. and all the other transformations can happen.
Yeah, I don't know if any of my viewers have 430 million to donate
Well,
to that, but they
every $100 helps.
I was going to say they may have 10, 20, $100.
There you go.
How do they make that donation to Habitat?
Well, they can just go on the website of their local Habitat. I highly recommend that you support your local community, and you can also give to Habitat International, which is doing amazing work, not only across the nation, but across the world.
And what about Restore?
So the Restore is a place where you can actually purchase and buy things that people donate. You have a shop there. And all of those proceeds go into that local Habitat's work to build housing and to preserve home ownership for their communities.
Great. So, Maureen hit on some really important points, Dr. Shin. She talked a lot about communities of color, the BIPOC community, and this initiative now for Habitat International. But I worry that in certain cities, and maybe even nationally, because the face of homelessness has changed, that is a part of why we don't see the political will. If the thinking is that homeless people are Black men, Black women, or Latinx, or Indigenous people, and we have these negative stereotypes that somehow because of your color, you are not hardworking, you're not deserving, you're drug addicted, you're less than. How do we fight that? Because that's been a part of the conversation here in LA County about like limited resources, right? Every government has limited resources. Where do you spend those resources? And there's become this big issue of hardworking immigrants, that narrative versus these other people of color who are homeless because they've made bad choices. That's kind of the narrative that gets played out a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea that homelessness is a choice is foolish. I mean, people may, out of defensiveness or whatever, say, yeah, I want to be here, but it depends on what's on offer. And if people actually believe you that housing is on offer, they will jump at the opportunity. So I don't think, maybe 1 in 1,000 people actually wants to live on the streets, but the other 999 folks will jump at the opportunity to get into housing. The United States has a long history of discrimination against folks of color. And it's historical discrimination when people of color weren't allowed to get loans that white people were allowed to get, or even people in integrated communities weren't allowed to get loans from the government that white people were allowed to get. And it's ongoing today. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development sends out testers, a white couple and a Black couple to apply for the same housing units. And if the white couple gets shown more units or gets a lower down payment or gets more sales effort, that's considered discrimination. And we keep doing the tests and we keep showing discrimination. It's illegal, but we aren't enforcing the laws. In employment, if you send out resumes to people that have names like Emily and Greg versus names like Jamal or Lakeisha, the callback ratio is such that having a white sounding name is worth 8 years of experience in people's ability to get jobs. Wow. So we have an ongoing problem, a serious problem of racial discrimination. And I think we need to look at ourselves and not look at those people. It's what's wrong with them. It's what's wrong with us.
Yeah. Great advice. Yes, it's easy to look at someone else, but it's a lot harder sometimes to just look at yourself in the mirror. Great information. Thank you so much, Dr. Shin. Thank you so much, Maureen, for the work that you're doing at Habitat. Mm-hmm. I love that both of you agree that this is a solvable problem. This is not one of those problems that we have to just throw our hands up in the air and say there's nothing we can do. It's just a matter of our political will. And our political will comes down to who is in office in our government, in our local, in our state, in our national government. And we all have an opportunity this November and even leading up to November to make choices. And those are some of the questions we should be asking those folks who are asking us to vote for them. Where are they on issues of housing? And are they committed to doing what's necessary, making the financial investments and making those changes to the laws that make it easier for homes to be built so that everyone can have housing in this country, because I agree with those right to housing advocates that say just like a public education, a house should not be, it shouldn't be negotiable. It should just absolutely not be negotiable. Thanks so much again for joining me this morning. I want to thank all of my guests. I don't know, again, I think David helped us understand where the middle class is. He talked about that median income being $70,000. So you can take a look at your income and decide where on that spectrum you fall, if you are still considered middle class, and or if you're now one of those people or one of those families that's moved into the upper tier and you are considered rich. I know a lot of my friends who are rich don't feel very rich because they are still paying hundreds of dollars at the gas, the pumps. They're paying lots more money for groceries, but I often remind them that at least they have a job and they have the ability to do that. So when those of us who are fortunate enough to have housing and to have the choice to buy gas and to buy food, we cannot forget how fortunate we are. And I just love that everyone today talked about the fact that, there may be one or two people that want to live in tents, but let's face it, who really wants to be on the streets with all the danger that's associated with living on the street, lack of plumbing, lack of running water, lack of electricity, all the bugs and the animals and all the other contagious things that you're going to come into contact with. And it's absolutely positively just horrific for families and people with children. And I have in LA County seen mothers with babies in tents and people washing clothes and trying to cook meals and doing things that are very dangerous. We've seen fires. We've seen people beaten and killed on the streets. So don't fool yourself, and think that people are there because they want to be there. And don't become so judgmental that you judge people for what their life circumstances have been. And those are my words to live by today. Don't judge a person by the choices they've made if you don't know the options that they had. Think about that. Be safe out there. And remember, we're all in this together.